Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode from the RPA Vanguard channel. This is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to be covering the last moving part of the UiPath Solution Accelerator template, and that is the performer process. So let's get started. We are back to the UiPath Studio, and I have the UiPath Performer template that is part of the UiPath Solution Accelerator template that's downloaded from the marketplace. And I'm going to start off with some of the key differences between what this template has to offer and how I have implemented, and how that kind of impacts how I have implemented my version of the Performer template. And before I proceed, I just want to make it very clear that if I'm pointing something out to you, and if something is missing or not implemented, you have to remember that these are templates, right? The solution accelerators are templates, and not everything would be 100% implemented, and it's not out of the box solutions, right? And therefore, if anything is not there or anything is missing, you are supposed to fill in the detail. I'm going to start off with some of the key points from our previous session where we covered the dispatcher, right? And the first place to start off would be this piece of code. If you remember in the previous session when we implemented the dispatcher, or when we covered the UiPath's implementation of the dispatcher, it does a very complex transformation of taking the raw data from the incoming files and then transforming them into a complex dictionary of JSON objects and then putting them in the queue. And here is one example snippet of that code that I want to touch upon. So here you can see that based on the type of object or the type of data that is coming from the file, the objects that are related to that data will be valid serialized objects in the queue, right? In this case, you see that the data that is being received in the Excel is coming from the energy tab. And therefore, if you look at it, the ESG data information object and the ESG energy data objects are valid objects. The other two objects, like emissions and waste, they are empty, right? And we covered this in detail. So what happens is by the time your dispatcher is done running, the data that's coming from the Excel has been transformed into complex JSON objects, right? And they are stored in the form of a dictionary in your queue item. And now when we come back to the performer template, you will see that the data that's in the queue item is being unpacked. And based on what kind of data you're unpacking from that queue item, that related object, that related data service entity record is created in the backend data service, right? So I'm going to skip all the other detail of the UiPath framework implementation and dive directly into process. And here you can see this code, the queue item that's been created as a result of this code now being unpacked, and then the logic deciding on what kinds of objects it has to create, right? Here, when the transaction object is fetched from the get transaction flow, it is of type queue item, right? You have to remember that because the data is stored in the queue, the transaction item is of type queue item, and then when it hits the process state, the first thing that the process state is going to do is inspect what kind of an object it is. And you can see that here, if I magnify this a little bit, if that queue specific item, that specific content is of type ESG energy data information and is of type ESG energy data, then the entities that are supposed to be created are ESG energy data information and ESG energy data. And if we go back to the data diagram, you can see that you have the ESG data information and then you have the ESG energy data, right? These are the two entities that we have to create in the data service. Assuming that the data that is received is of type ESG energy, a couple of things are going to happen first. This data that you have earlier serialized using the logic in your dispatcher is now going to be deserialized into a couple of strings, right? You have ESG data information and ESG energy data. They are going to be deserialized. You can see that here, deserialized object of type ESG data information, and the specific content that has to be retrieved from the queue is ESG energy data information. And similarly, this deserialization here that's going to happen is of type ESG data energy, and the queue specific item is ESG energy data, right? So now that we have got those as strings, you call the method, the library method, create ESG data information record. Obviously, because you have referenced the sustainability data collection reusables library here, that related method is available, right? So the first thing you do is you create the ESG data information record. And then you get the ID that needs to be related to the ESG data energy in the form of data information ID, right? So you first create the data information object. And then once you do that, the next call will be for you to create the ESG energy data record, which creates this object in your underlying data service entity. So very simple here. What happens here is a couple of calls, and you first create the data information and then you create the data record itself, right? Something similar happens with emission related queue item. If the data type that's received is emissions related, you do the same thing. You deserialize it, and then you call those methods that are supposed to create those records for you. And the whole thing repeats for the waste related data as well. So now that we know how this sustainability data collection library is used within the context of the Performer template, let's look at this library and look closer to see what we can learn from that implementation. All right, so I am back in studio again, and in this case, I have opened up the sustainability data collection reusables library, which is part of the Solution Accelerator download. And here is the first call that you make, which is the create ESG data information record, right? That's the first one that you're calling, ESG data information record, create ESG data information record. And this is the method that you're looking at, right? And the argument to this would be an ESG data information object. And then that item is passed to as input record. And then that object is created and populated with the ID, right? As you can see, the input and the output are the same. But what happens is when this object gets created in the data service entity, the ID is passed back to the same object, right? So now once you have that data information record, you assign the data information record relationship to the energy data object, and that happens in the Performer, right? So if we go back to the Performer, you will see that once the data information record is created, that relationship is assigned to the energy data object. So here, if I open it, ESG data record dot data information ID is assigned that ESG energy data information record. So fundamentally, you have formed a relationship between this object, ESG data information, taken its ID, and then associated that with the data information ID of the ESG data energy, right? The next action that's going to be called is to create this data energy object itself in data service. right? And that method is create ESG energy data record. If I go back into the library and go into create ESG energy data record, you will see that again, the argument to it that's coming in is ESG data record of type ESG data energy. It is passed in, and then the object is created in the data service, and you get an ID, an object with a valid ID back as output. There are a few things that I really want to point out, right, which I'll then be addressing in my implementation of the Performer template, as well as which I've already addressed in my data service library implementation, right? There is this very important method implemented in the stock UiPath implementation of this library, and that's called the energy data transformation, right? And if you look at it, this is where this is very important because what it does is it fully forms this ESG data energy, right? All these steps that are required for you to fully form this ESG data energy is covered in this in this flow, right? So what do we mean by saying fully formed, right? So if you look at the sustainability data diagram and look at this object, the ESG data energy, you will see that it has many number of attributes, and some of the attributes are in bold and the others are in normal font, right? So the attributes that are in normal font are the inherent attributes of the energy data record itself, right? The fuel type, consumption, the amount of consumption, etc., right? All of these are its own inherent inherent attributes. Now, those attributes are coming in from your Excel record, right? All of this will be in that Excel file, and then you assign those the pieces of data that you're getting from Excel file to these data points. But that is not enough, right? Because if this data energy object has to be loaded into data service, then all its master entity relationships must be fully formed, right? And we looked at one example of that, right? We created a data information record and then associated data information ID here. Similarly, we have to make sure that all the other related master entity records are existing. And if they're existing, the record IDs of those entities must be associated to this ESG data energy entity, right? For example, let's take a look at ESG currency, right? So the currency code that's required to check for an ESG currency entity comes from your raw data, right? So what this method does is it goes in here. It first assigns all the inherent attributes like fuel type, consumption quantity, the consumption amount. You see that fuel type, consumption amount, consumption quantity, etc. It assigns that first to this energy data service entity, right? And then it takes the raw attributes coming in from your input record, which is your Q item, and then it calls another very important action or flow called get energy master data, right? Now, this get energy master data is in the business of querying all these master entity records, and then if they are available, form those relationships between that master entity and this new record that you're going to be creating for ESG energy, right? So if I open that, let's take the currency example. We know that the data that's being passed in to it is the currency code. You see it's passed in as a form of string. And then this method will run a query on the ESG energy entity. You can see that it is running, ESG currency entity. And then it filters it by that currency code. And if that record is existing, it will be populated in a list of type ESG currency code, right? So if the record exists, then this list will contain one record. If it does not exist, then this list will be empty. Similarly, it's going to query the energy consumptions category and also several other entities that you see here. There are too many to list. Energy sold category, and anything that you see in bold here will be queried, and those will be returned to their respective list objects. Now, here's something that happens, which is very interesting. We go all the way down here. There is a check performed to see if any of these entities that we queried for are available, right? For example, if I queried ESG currency by currency code for US dollar, has that entity been returned? And if that entity has been returned, then you can see that the list ESG currency code list will have a count greater than 0. That means there's an entity there. And if that is so, then that relationship between ESG currency and ESG energy is created here. So if I go in here, you can see that ESG energy data currency code has been assigned that relationship from that entity that has been returned in the list. So that entity is returned as the first member of that list, and it has been assigned to this ESG energy record in the currency code field. Similarly, all these relationships like energy consumption category name, UOM mapping ID, energy category sold name, etc. All of those relationships are checked and they are formed here, right? Now, assuming all of these entities have been properly populated and the data for those entities is existing in those master entity tables, then this becomes a fully formed energy record and it is ready to be created in the data service entity, right? But if any of these entities are not existing in those master tables, but they are required when creating that ESG energy data record, then you cannot create this ESG data energy because all those data relationships are not yet complete. This object is not complete, and therefore it is going to fail, right? So when you try to create this data energy record, it will fail, right? So an important thing that I need to point out to you here with reference to that is, first, all these checks look for the existence of the master record. And if it's existing, they assign that relationship to the record that you're trying to create. But you see there is nothing in the else. The else is empty. And if you check all of these, the else is empty, right? Now that has not been implemented here. Again, because this is a template, it is up to us to fill in that information. So what happens if any of these entity records are not, master entity records are not existing? You have to plan the logic on how to deal with that. So what would happen if the dispatcher finds out, or the performer finds that it looked for currency coming in for this particular data energy record and it did not find it? If it didn't find it, you have to create that ESG currency record and then get that valid ID of ESG currency data record and then assign it to the currency code relationship of the ESG data energy. So if you look at it, all of these are empty, and these are the things that you must fill, right? You must fill in and complete the entire picture. The other thing that I have not seen is this energy data transformation call I might have missed something, or I don't know if, I've not looked closely enough, but this call to data transformation actions, there are three of them, one for energy, one for waste, one for emissions. I have not seen these calls being made in the performer template, right? So if I go out here and look into the performer, I do not see that call here, right? So that's another thing that you have to make sure that you have to take care of, because this entire data transformation must happen if your raw data has to be converted into an entity object, right? That will then be used to create that data service entity record, right? And therefore, it is up to you to decide where to put these actions, one each for energy, one each for, and one for emissions, and one for waste, right? So very important, make sure that you bring in those methods or library action calls in your performer where they're required. And the third most important thing that you must note is that you have very few data transformation actions and very few record operation actions, right? You see, only the main objects have been exemplified here and implemented here. In reality, you have got several other entities that you need to have actions to create those records in your data service, right? For example, if you look at, again, EST currency, there is no method that actually does the currency transformation, nor is there a method that does the actual record operation of creating EST currency. So you will have to implement that. So keep these three aspects in mind, right? And make sure that when you implement your library, it is complete in all respects. So in the next section, we will be hopping over to how I have implemented my version of the performer. And there you will see that the implementation is more complete, and we'll be able to walk through a set of more organized steps in the implementation of that performer process.